So we pray, Lord God, Heavenly Father, accept our thanks that you have given us your word, and through that word, knowledge of your Son, Jesus Christ, in whom we have salvation. We, especially at this time of year, as we get set to celebrate the Reformation, pray that we may treasure that scripture that has been preserved for us, and that we may believe it with all our hearts and minds. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Yeah, today we're going to move on to the topic of modern translations and picking ones that that will be suitable for whatever purpose it is that. And there is an enormous variety of translations that are available now. It's not like the situation, let's say, 80, 100 years ago, where the only game in town, in practical terms, was the King James. A few people that really were into Bible study would have the American Standard Version. That was put out in the 1880s. My grandfather had one, left it, to me. And, you read it, it attempted to be up to date as far as the problems with the King James were concerned, in that it used better and newer manuscripts. I'll talk about that more. But the English was worse. Just difficult to read, to understand.
I understand that the New American Standard, as well as the ESV, are some of the closest of the English translations to the original Greek, Hebrew and Greek. In other words, they were translated directly from the Hebrew and Greek.
All of your translations that are available that we're going to talk about are now direct translations from the Hebrew and the Greek. Nearly all of them. The issue, the issue is you have to understand what the words that you use mean. See, when you say close, that they are close, that implies that others are not. And it also ignores the question of what you mean by close. See, if you mean a literal, close as possible literally, you will come up with a translation that is not understandable here in English. We're going to talk about this as we get into it. What principle you use in order to make a translation. Now, another thing to bear in mind is there are so many different translations. You have to also understand that what you plan on doing with the translation makes a difference on which one that you choose. I'll give you an example is at home. Every Good Friday, school would close with a half day, and we would have a noonday Good Friday service, also open to the community. Many times grandparents or whatever would be picking up the kids and they would be there. Traditionally, in the Good Friday service, the Passion of our Lord according to St. John is read. Now, because in the evenings we used to do a 10-bread service with the darkening of the church, and that I did not read the Passion according to John in the evening. So therefore, I read it in the noonday service. And because 80%, let's say, of the congregation were kids, you're not going to read it in the American Standard Version, or the King James, because they're not going to get it. So I would read it in the CEV, the Contemporary English Version, put out by the American Bible Society, which was excellent for kids. I wouldn't use it in a Bible class, but if you're, in the kind of circumstances I was using. For example, when they're mocking Jesus, "Hey, you, King of the Jews." No, that's much closer to what the text would have meant, and the effect of the text was saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." See, who talks that way? Yeah, now they call for Barabbas. Now, and this translation, now Barabbas was a terrorist, which is exactly what he was, in a modern kind of context. Yeah, not a thief in the way that you think of a thief. Thief is a guy who, picks pockets or swipes old ladies' purses. No, that isn't it at all. This is a political operative kind of a guy, a lay-stakes. So in that context, that particular translation was really appropriate. If I were teaching a Bible class on Holy Communion, I would not use it, because it doesn't catch what the text is saying. There I would use something that was, I don't want to say more literary, that's not the point, but something that was probably closer in a way that I'm going to talk about to the Greek and the Hebrew, and give up intelligibility for nearness to the original languages, because I would have the opportunity to explain it. Now, another thing is certain translations work better for public reading than others. We with dizzying speed, every 10 years or so. In the church, that's dizzying speed. But you may remember, so now we use the ESV in our service book and in our lectionaries. That's what you hear read out. If you were to go back 10, 15 years, you would hear NIV. Yeah. Okay, those are both good translations. One of them is a little bit better for public reading. Which one would you say is better for public reading? No, I would go with the ESV. Yeah, the rhythm, the meter of the King James is somewhat preserved. Less understandable. So if you're thinking in terms of the person who is hearing it has to go back in their mind and say, now what on earth is that saying? Then the NIV. But if you're talking about the cadence and the rhythm of the language as it is publicly proclaimed or almost performed, then I would go with ESV. Yeah. But you get what I'm saying is that depending on your circumstances, one translation might be better than another one. Yeah, just how you're going to use the thing matters. The minute that you choose a translation, you are already being an interpreter. Yeah, I mean, the only way that even if I were to read the gospel text in Greek on a Sunday morning, to a slight degree, I would be an interpreter. Why? Because there are approximately 5,000 to 7,000 manuscripts of the whole or part of the New Testament, no two of which are identical. No, when you copy something for 2,000 years, and the longer it is, the more this is true, what's going to creep in?
Yeah, changes.
Changes, errors, right.
Isn't it true that a good portion or number of those 5,000 to 7,000, you said, were, let's say, in the first few hundred years?
No, and that's part of the problem with the King James.
Well, yeah, I get that.
The exact opposite is that the really old ones are few and far between. I'll get to that when we get down to establishing the biblical text down the page here. But no, it's the opposite, and that was behind Erasmus's, which the King James is ultimately based on. So at some point, you are inevitably going to end up being an interpreter, just simply by what you choose and how you read it. And all translations fail at some point or another. Yeah, some more, some less, but there is not a one out there that isn't going to botch it in some way or another. Sometimes that's inevitable. Example I gave you here, really difficult thing to translate is from 1 Corinthians 7:36. Okay, the New King James translates, if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin. What is the problem with that? Yeah, you don't know what it's talking about. Yeah, presumably it's a woman. Yeah, but beyond that, is it his fiancée? Is it his daughter? Is it the organist? Yeah,
Good.
I probably should stop there. But you see, that is a translation that is, your terms, Kevin, literal.
Yeah.
But it's meaningless because you don't know what it's talking about. Yeah. Now you've got three interpretations of it. The New American Standard Bible, if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter. Now, that makes sense, right? But it might not be right. NIV, if anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, they now all of a sudden it's not the daughter, it's what?
His fiance.
His fiance. Okay, the NEB. If a man has a partner in celibacy and feels that he is not behaving properly toward her, what about that one? What's that talking about? Yes, yeah.
Yes.
See, there you would have to know that St. Paul in the context talks about, don't I have the right to be accompanied by a woman as a sister? So almost like a nun. Probably, though, that's an anachronism. That's not really what he needs. So the New English Bible, which I'm not particularly fond of, that was a big deal in the 60s. The New English Bible, it's hardly any more understandable here than the New King James. But you see the problem. Which of the four do you think is probably the best?
Yeah.
Probably the NIV. Yeah, probably the NIV. But don't know. Yeah, see, the issue here is that, and again, I'm kind of picking on the New King James. The New King James, well, I'll talk more about it later. It's ambiguous. And one thing we can be certain about is that Paul did not intend to be ambiguous. Yeah, he intended to be clear. And we will assume that the folks that he wrote that to at Corinth knew what he meant. Yeah, but we don't. Because what's the problem we face, just like we talked about when we were studying 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? We are eavesdroppers. We're eavesdroppers on a conversation that was not initially intended to be between us and the apostle, but between the Corinthian congregation and the apostle. None of these, see again to underscore, none of these is a bad translation. They're all possible, right? But only one of them can be correct. So already in this passage, and this is just 4 translations. These 4, any one of them has a 75% chance of being misunderstood. So you see the issues. Okay, rules for the student of the Bible. Regularly read mainly in one good translation. So pick one But this is for your own personal reading. Pick one that suits your level of English, whatever. Pick one and stick with it. Why?
Get used.
You get used to it. I want to go further and say right there, it aids your memory.
Yeah.
One of the problems that we have in the Synod, and I guess there's no real solution to it, is we keep changing the blinking hymnal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, from the reaction, I understand where it's coming from. And I don't mean changing it in the sense that we deep six some hymns and replace them with newer modern ones or whatever. That's fine. I remember a conversation I had with a dear old member who was so mightily sorrowful that Nearer My God to Thee was dropped from the hymnal. And I said, well, the Titanic sank long ago, let it fly. Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, picking out what you put in your hymnal is one of the least, least pleasant jobs that anyone in the church has. United Methodist Church, this is 25, 30 years ago, when they were putting out a new hymnal, they polled their membership. And what they polled them was they asked them, in the new hymnal, what hymn absolutely must be in it, and what hymn absolutely should be dropped. The problem, they found out, was it was the same hymn. And by the way, we sang it today. Yeah, namely,
How great thou art.
how great thou art.
Wow.
Yeah, led both lists. Well, how are you going to make both sides happy on that one?
You put half in one set of hymnals, the other half in. Leave it out.
Yeah, you only put in 2 verses. Yeah. That was an issue with the TLH. How many of those have 15 verses?
Yeah.
Especially the communion hymns.
Right.
But on and on and on. I ran into this many years ago when I was pastor at Redeemer in Ontario and confirmations. See, and it's not just the hymnal, they kept changing the catechism. And there was one point where, doing memory work with the kids, I had to listen to the kids say their catechism in 4 different translations. 4! Being the one that I grew up with. Okay, the revision of that one, the Wisconsin Synod one, because we had a boy from that synod was in our confirmation class, and the ELCA one. Yeah, and so, no. What, and see, the worst thing is if you grow up with one version, and then you move to another one, my dear wife, she's not been able to attend worship in a while, but if you sat near her, you sometimes will hear her singing the TLH version of whatever it is that we're doing in the worship service. She just, not on it. The these and the thous aren't so much the issue. Sometimes, they're not as unintelligible as people make them. But I get kind of a little frustrated when they correct the poetry of someone like Christopher Wordsworth or Alexander Pope. These are major English poets, and they, and they have the chutzpah to change the wording. Yeah, no. But anyway, I'll get off my hobby.
And use liturgy.
We do basically have one. We don't use it. Setting 4, prayers and hymnal is basically page 15 with very few changes. I regularly have you all sing the Agnus Dei for Christ our Lamb of God. Yeah. Anyway, good translations will have notes. Now, I'm not talking about annotations, which are like study notes or that. I'm talking about, you will see, I'll just take out, this is RSV, which to kind of use mostly. If I were to look here, almost any page where it doesn't work. Okay, here, the rich man and Lazarus. Okay, you will see tiny little notes here. Mammon is a Semitic word for money or riches. Okay, other scandalon here, Greek stumbling blocks. Okay, or stumble. Sometimes you will also see other ancient, here's one. Other ancient authorities read, filled his belly with. That's the prodigal son, the pods that that the swine take. So those kinds of little notes are good for letting you know where the editorial board or the translating committee, and a committee translation is always better than a single person's. Yeah, where there was a difference of opinion or there was a difference of choices. And so what they will do is they will give you an alternative in the footnotes. See, an example would be this 1 Corinthians 7:36. A good translation would pick, I'm going to pick the NIV one, but then I would put as a footnote, or acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter. See, so that you know that there is a possibility of going in a different direction.
What about those that like
Yeah. Well, we ran into that in Job quite a lot. Yeah, because the Hebrew of Job is what we call archaizing. And it probably uses more northern dialect stuff than we're used to. Most of the Old Testament comes from the south. From Judah, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, that area. Whereas the northern dialect and the northern traditions were a little bit different. That's why we have two versions. One is the southern, one is the northern. Slight differences. Okay, so good translations are going to have those little notes. I do remember, again, it was when I was at Redeemer, there was a lay reader and he read right on through and then read right down the column other ancient authorities had. Just as I happen to follow, right. Okay, so regularly read mainly in one good translation. Second, study from a variety of translations, especially ones known to differ. So if you're doing a Bible study or you're trying to study a passage, look at 2 or 3 translations. You guys don't know the Hebrew and the Greek and that. So, you're going to have to rely on some translator's opinion about what it says. And by having 2 or 3, one of the things that it will do is it will pop up to you what are some of the issues for this particular text. What should I be looking for, and questioning about? It is wise then also to choose translations when you're using your 2 or 3 that differ from one another. That increases the usefulness of having more than one. So, again, I will read typically RSV. I will also use NIV, and I will use TEB, the Good News Bible, today's English version. That's another one I will use with kids if I don't have the CED around. All of these letters, keep track of them. Third, resolving differences can often be done by consulting commentaries. the danger, this is more, now, I teach pastors this stuff too. And I used to actually taught this subject at Concordia Irvine in the master's program. One of the things that you have to ingrain in people is don't immediately run to a commentary. Yeah, don't do that. Commentaries are helpful. They're useful, especially when there's something really strange going on, like 1 Corinthians 7:36. But you don't want to run immediately to a commentary. For one thing, that instills in you the habit of being lazy. For another thing, you're abdicating your responsibility of understanding the text to someone else. Yeah, so, it is good to consult them, but not first thing. All right, yeah.
Is it the main purpose then, or at least in your view, to consult the commentaries to like find out the meaning of a phrase or word?
It might be, that's one thing. Yeah, there's several things. We're gonna get into, questions of text and stuff like that. Number 4, to make an intelligent choice in what translations you want to use, it's helpful to know something about how translations are made. Right? Makes sense. Okay. 2 issues when you are translating. The first is that you have to establish the biblical text. That's called lower criticism. And what does that mean? As I mentioned earlier, there are thousands of Greek, and I'm going to stick mostly with the Greek here because the Hebrew would work somewhat differently, but I will talk about that too. But there are thousands of Greek manuscripts of all or parts of the New Testament. And as I said, no two are exactly alike. So that means, and by the way, you do not in any case have the original copies. When we talk about inspiration, we tend to say it is, the text is inspired in the original draft, which means what? The Apostle Paul or Matthew actually wrote on his hunk of papyrus, or had the secretary write, in the case of Paul. So we don't have those. Even if we did, it wouldn't totally solve the problem. One of the things I looked at yesterday in preparation, just for fun, was the Declaration of Independence. Now that's only 250-ish years old, right? Yeah, and so it's something in the modern era. Do we have the original copy? What do you think?
So something in the Congress, I guess.
Well, that thing that you saw in the National Archives, see, that begs a question. What, once again, always ask questions. What do you mean by the original? Are you talking about the draft that Thomas Jefferson gave to the committee for comments before being presented to the Congress? Are you talking about the draft that the Congress actually accepted?
Yes.
Which was then taken out and copies were made of it, signed only by John Hancock and one other guy. Then that was taken to the printer, who ran off about 100 copies, I believe, 200, one of which was sent to the king, a couple of which had popped up in England, of all places. Or do you mean the copy that you saw at the National Archives if you went there, which is fading away, that has all of those signatures at the bottom, which was made later in the month when they got everybody together? You see the problems. Do you think all of those copies, whichever one you might be talking about, agree with each other? No, probably not.
I would think the ones that got printed. Printer printed, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
you mean the first printing or the second printing after they went in and corrected the typesettings?
the type that they,
Oh, yeah, no, you see the problems. Right, now, does it really matter much? No. No, because, these copies are gonna be, what, 99.9% the same. Or, there might be a turn of phrase that's different. Franklin changed some of Jefferson's wording, like inalienable. That's a Franklin word. That's not a Jefferson word. So, you have that kind of thing. And by the way, see, that's going to bring up something here that it established in text. Is it's important to note that that's a Franklin word and not a Jefferson word, because if you're trying to establish the original text, you want to take into account the stylistic moves of the author, right? So, if you're trying to establish the text of the Declaration of Independence, you want to know how Jefferson sounds. Because then if there's something that's questionable, right, it doesn't kind of fit, then, oh yeah, that's probably by John Jay or by Franklin or one of the other guys that revised it. And this is true in our study of the Bible too, not just establishing the text, but certain authors have certain conventions. We all do. We will say things in English in different ways, and we get fixed in a habit of how we do it. For example, which of these is correct? I like swimming. I like to swim.
Yes.
They're both correct. No, and do they mean the same thing? Watching other people doing it. I should have said, I like eating. I like to eat. And then watching other people, you never get point well taken. But see, some of us will favor using the participle, Latin, I call it a gerund, eating. Others of us would prefer the infinitive construction, to eat, right? And so, if you are writing a letter to grandma and you're talking about how you love eating her Christmas cookies, some of you are going to use the one form and some are going to use the other form. See, a teacher, particularly like at a high school level, which I did for 3 years, you get to be sensitive to this stuff because you're picking up whether or not the kid plagiarized.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, because you see, they have a style. And when one student turned in a paper in my ethics class that was clearly written for a MA course by her sister, and it wasn't hard for me to call her out on that. Yeah, because you figure it out. This kid didn't write this. You need an advanced degree for it. So the first thing is trying to establish as close as possible what the original autograph said. We do not, as I said, have that. Right, so it's a scientific process. There are certain rules, there are certain protocols, algorithms that you apply to the plethora of manuscripts in order to come up with what it is that the original said. It's never going to be 100%, but it's going to be like 99. It's going to be real close to. In fact, I believe that our current understanding of the text, and again, this is New Testament, is approximately 2nd century. So the text as we have it, the Greek text of the New Testament as we have it, essentially matches how the text read about the year 150. But see, that's 80 years after much of it was written. When will most of the errors enter the text? Early or late?
Early.
Early, absolutely, because that's before it's established. Yeah, once it's established, it's a lot harder to change the text. Yeah. See, now, in establishing the text, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this, but this is one of the reasons why the King James is not a good study Bible. It's great for Christmas cards, but not a good study Bible, because Erasmus, when he produced his Greek New Testament, he's a humanist and produced this. He was presented with, he had about, I think, a dozen manuscripts that he could use. Okay, now he's working in the early 16th century, late 15th. What kinds of manuscripts would you guess he had available? Old ones or new ones? New ones. New ones, because by far the largest number of them were the late ones. Okay, so if you have as a principle, when you are preparing your text, that and there's a question about what this passage reads, you can say, well, I have a dozen manuscripts and 10 of them say this, and the 11th says this, and the 12th is almost like the 11th, but a little different. Well, we're going to pick the 10. We're going to pick the 10 because that's the most. But you see, that's also all of the new ones. So just on the surface of it, which ones are likely, more likely, I shouldn't say likely, but more likely to be original? 11 and 12. Okay, yes, that's a problem. Beza, a scholar in Geneva, somewhere down there, Swiss department. Beza prepared the translation of the prepared the New Testament text that was actually used by the King James guys. Based it on Erasmus. Beza had a 6th century manuscript he owned, a good one, Codex Bezae. But he didn't use it because it was so different from the most of them. See, later on, people kind of figured that, this principle of using the most common one to establish the text is not the best procedure.
So what you just said, doesn't that kind of contradict what you said kind of earlier, that he had the 6th century manuscript that was very good,
It was quite good.
in which he should have used.
Yeah.
But he did not, because he used the later one, right?
We used the later ones because the later ones all agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is typical, right? I mean, that you would expect that.
If your principle is the majority rules, and that's the bad principle. See, and around about the 19th century, they figured it out that this wasn't the way to go. Then you have the discovery in the 19th century, for example, of 2 really good manuscripts that are old. 4th century, probably. One is called Vaticanus. They found it in the Vatican Library. The other is called Sinaiticus, and that was found by a kind of archaeological guy, Tischendorf, who was at the monastery of St. Catherine's in the Sinai Desert. Okay, and he saw a monk proceeding to throw leaves of manuscripts into a fire to keep warm, and went. Yeah, so, and it is an excellent manuscript, and it is quite close to the Vatican manuscript. So he got it, he sold it to the Tsar of Russia. It sat in St. Petersburg for a while until British school children raised enough money to buy it during the Russian Revolution, when the communist, atheistic Bolsheviks, and all those nasty folks, were willing to sell off anything that brought them in any hard cash. So British school children raised money and bought it, and so now you can see it in the British Museum. Both of these probably, I don't know, probably, at least certainly a strong possibility, were manuscripts that were produced by orders of the Emperor Constantine when he footed the bill to make a certain set of copies of the Bible to be included in important churches. So they probably date to that, the 4th century. Sinaiticus has the Apocrypha in it and a couple of things that aren't in the New Testament. So that's another interesting deal. Plus, in the 19th century, this is a great age of exploration in Egypt. Yeah, and so they were digging up all kinds of papyrus fragments, in the Fayum region in Egypt, and these had a text often of the New Testament. You wouldn't tend to find a whole Bible, but you might find, several pages and stuff like that. And, these are old. The oldest fragment actually comes from Egypt from about 135. A friend of mine, a godfather of his one son, who's professor in Manchester and is the guardian of this fragment in the Rylands Papyri, University of Manchester in England. It's a portion of the Gospel according to St. John, dates back to 135-ish AD. That's the oldest copy we got of anything in the New Testament. So now you have Greek texts being prepared by people like Tischendorf with not the principle of whoever has the most manuscripts reading this way, but whatever is the oldest. Okay, that's better. Is that the best? No, no. Because, Egypt is kind of an isolated place, right? So maybe there was, one of these very old ones that's found in Egypt happened to be kind of on the fringes. So then, you have to come up with this is scientific, you have to come up with other ways of dealing with the thousands of changes and differences that you have. So the next step was to organize these manuscripts, including the papyri, into families. Because if you have a particular copy someplace like Egypt, and they're making copies of it in a scriptorium, those copies they make of it are going to perpetuate the mistakes that were originally in them. So you kind of try to arrange things. Here's the original. Here. We don't have any of that. But see, here we have an Egyptian text. Then we have over here so-called Western texts. We have closer to that the Caesarean text, centering around Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea, who was chaplain to the Emperor Constantine. All right. Then you have the Byzantine text, Koine. So you have certain families, and now you analyze the characteristics of these families. Which is the best? The Egyptian, because in Egypt, they had a tradition of accuracy in writing up their manuscripts, for one thing, for the library at Alexandria and that. This is also true of the Old Testament, not the New Testament here. In the Old Testament, you have it's called the Masoretic text, which is medieval, the Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali manuscript. So this is maybe around the year 1000. Okay, then you see in 1948, somewhere around when I was born, mostly in the 50s, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Yeah, You have the Masoretic text. You also have, I'm just going to use the Greek translation, the Septuagint. And sometimes this Hebrew traditional text, this was done about BC 200. Okay, these two don't always agree, and sometimes quite radical. The book of Jeremiah, for example, is I think 18% shorter here than it is there. That's a major difference. Yeah, okay, so, which do you use? See here, this is the most recent one. This is older. Is this therefore better? Well, you've got another issue, is these guys were really good and have a tradition of copying manuscripts accurately in Judaism, very accurate. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and they date to around the turn of the era, so I'm going to put the year 1. Should I make it BC or AD? Your choice. Around about that time, lo and behold, it was quite close. So the decision to use the Hebrew Bible, as the basis for English translations was the best one. Now, you've got to regularly check this, because sometimes, like we saw when we were studying Job, the Hebrew text doesn't make sense, right? And so often, this is the text that you want to go, when there is a difficulty. That's Old Testament kind of thing. Well, see, like the Jews have this tradition of accurate, careful copying, that was also the case in Egypt. And so generally, the Egyptian family of manuscripts is going to be better. The Western one tended to add stuff. They add stuff in. But now if you have, this one was the one, of course, that Erasmus and Beza used, because the Byzantine Koine means common. Common version is the one that everybody wrote. Yeah, not the best. Okay, if you have 4, let's say different readings in a passage, and this one agrees with this one, and these two are different, you can be certain these are correct, right? Because this is a good one, the best tradition, and this tradition is normally not so good, but it's about as far away from this one as you can get. So when these two agree, that's where you go. One last little bit is that, okay, they're arranged into families, but you have now better, in modern editions, you have even better ways of determining this. And so the rule in figuring out this text is which reading explains others. Yeah, so whichever reading explains how the other readings came about is going to be the right one. It's also a secondary rule is the reading, you're going to love this, the reading that you don't like is probably right. Yeah, it is. It absolutely is, because you got to think like a monk who's power of copyist. Is the guy going to make the text tougher? No. He's going to correct it in order to improve it. And if it's hard to understand, he's going to change it a little bit to make it easier. Or if there are any, for example, weird grammatical constructions, he's going to get rid of those in favor of standard ones. So the difficult text is almost always the correct one. Like I said, you hate that. Yeah, because you want it to be simple.
Example of
I'll give an example.
Because you're not necessarily talking about the age.
No, at this point, you're talking about how you can explain it. See, I wasn't gonna go into it, but see, there's rules also how scribes think. And so, you yourself probably run into this problem of, I hate spell check. Because it keeps telling me that I want to say things that I don't want to say. Yeah, because see, the algorithms behind that program are assuming how most ordinary people are going to write stuff and not how clergy things. So, yeah, no, so there's issues here. You have all kinds of things. Homeoteluton. Oh, what's that's a big word? That means that when two lines in a manuscript close the same way. Okay, like I was using swimming. She likes riding. I like swimming, but my sister likes riding. Okay, your eye sometimes will jump from this one, particularly when you're copying, because good copyists don't pay attention to content. They only pay attention to that. That's true of type setters and type readers. You don't want to look at the content. You want to look at what's right there. So your eye sometimes will jump from there to there. And what happens is which line gets left out. Yeah, same thing happens when you have two lines that start the same way. Another problem is pronunciation. Remember, the stuff is read, dictated, and then you have slaves who can copy in the scriptorium. These two words, pardon my grief. This means to you, second person singular. This means us or we. In Egypt, and again, where you have the best traditions of copying, these were pronounced exactly the same way. Yeah, imin. And so when the scribe is copying and he's listening to the guy up there on the bema, the front, reading the text, and the guy says, imin, some of them are going to put down you, and some are going to put down us. Yeah. God, the Apostle Paul might write at the end of a letter, may God bless you. And some of them are going to hear it as may God bless us. See, and so now you got the problem of trying to sort out which is the right one. Then that one is really hard to do. But again, if you were in another region of the empire, then they wouldn't necessarily have pronounced those as exactly the same way. Yeah, I would pronounce reading marks. Imi, Amy. That's very different. You mean Amy. But if you're in Egypt, Imi. Yeah, so you see the difficulties. Okay, so good translations will have either at the foot or in the margin notes with alternates. Other ancient authorities read. And so what's going on there is that the committee that has produced the text, there's a whole, Bruce Metzger was a leading authority on this use, Ezra Princeton, wrote a whole commentary on the choices made for the United Bible Society's New Testament put out, invaluable, in which he rated things A, B, C, or D. So if it was rated A, question about the text, that meant we're almost certain this is what it was. B, little doubt. C, D. Yeah, so you can actually look this up. This is where commentaries are useful. If there is a question about, I'll give you an example. if you're using an older copy of the RSV and you are looking at Luke's gospel and the Passion account, the account of the institution of communion, you're going to see the words on the cup not there. And they will be in the footnote, other ancient authorities read. Now, the RSV has since restored them to the text. But see, what on earth is going on? See, that's the kind of question you've got to look at. That will tell you what the issues are and why you see them. But that's rare. See, so again, external evidence, that means basically the number and the quality of particular manuscripts. Internal evidence, that's how scribes think and work. And once again, I put there the principle, the reading that best explains the others is generally correct. You can't assume 100% of it. Yeah, and sometimes readings, where do they come from? You can't figure it out. How much of the text are we talking about here that is insecure? Less than 1%. Yeah, so yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about this, and that less than 1%. And many times, although there are variations, it's not going to mean much in terms of meaning at all. Finally, does it matter if the text said, you or us? An example, not really. There will be some classic large things. I'll give you one example. If you were to look at John chapter 7 and 8, the story of the woman taken in adultery, that is now printed either in square brackets or as a footnote to the text, because it's not in the best of the oldest manuscripts of John's gospel. There are even a couple manuscripts where it is inserted into Luke. So what does that automatically tell you? That ain't original. Now, is it true? Is the story true? Probably. But it's probably an example of something passed down in the oral tradition, and some scribe said, hey, shouldn't we include this somewhere? And so he stuck it into John's gospel, or where if you read Greek, you can see this isn't the same author. Doesn't look, the language isn't used the same way. See, so there will be another example when we were studying Mark 3 years ago, the long ending of Mark. Not in the best manuscripts.
Chapter 16.
Chapter 16, verse 8 was the last thing, I'm totally convinced, the last thing that Mark wrote. But then you have the verses 9 to 16 were added to make it match what a gospel author looked like. So, yeah, those kinds of things through commentaries are good.
Just one question, you mentioned the story of, woman in adultery. And don't they have that account somewhere from some original text, like what John actually did write, or what Luke actually wrote? Or it's found somewhere else?
It's found mostly in John, or occasionally in Luke. But the assumption is that this is a story that happens. Like much, I've talked about this. Much of the New Testament originally, at some point, particularly the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, was handed down by oral tradition or word of mouth. So when somebody wrote a gospel, did they write down everything? John tells you at the end of his gospel he didn't. Jesus, John's saying Jesus did many other things which are not written in this book. Is he just talking about what does happen to be written in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? I don't think so. See, what he's talking about is there's other stuff going around in the oral tradition that did not meet his purposes. And so he didn't include it. I'll give you one example. In John's gospel, in the crucifixion scene, there is no indication of the darkness over the land. It's not there. No ripping of the temple curtain, no earthquake. None of that. See, and so that was in the tradition, clearly, because Mark has it, Matthew and Luke, following Mark, have it. But John does not have it. This is the same thing. Let's use this principle. Which best explains it? Now you gotta be careful. Is it easier to think that it happened and John didn't write it down for some reason, or that it didn't happen and Mark wrote it into his gospel for some reason? You can argue the case both ways. However, see, what's going to become important in making your decision is an analysis and understanding of how Mark on the one hand and John on the other hand think. Now, for John, what is the greatest moment in everything that Jesus does? No, not the resurrection. When I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. No, lifted up is punning on crucifixion. No, it's the crucifixion. That's why you have no in John. See, he omits, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Because this is his triumph. We see Christ reigning in triumph from the tree. That's the theme, the Vexilla Regis in the hymnody for Good Friday. So, yeah, John, we can understand that John would have omitted any mention of darkness, because that would have fed into what you see in Luke's gospel when Jesus is arrested. Now is the hour of the power of darkness. For John, no, it ain't. This is when the light shines most clearly, when he is lifted up. As Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him would have eternal life. No, the moment when everything comes together in John is the cross. That's why you have, again, the last word of Jesus, it is finished. Because that's the moment of triumph. So, think Cecil B. DeMille. Are you going to talk about darkness? No. So John just opts not to include it. They do this all the time, these evangelists, because they have a point of view. And that, you have given what happened, the events, but in the telling of the events, they have a point of view about what those events mean. And so they are going to choose to report certain things and not other things, because certain things will fit in with the picture that they are communicating. And so that's why John leaves out a whole bunch of stuff. But what he puts in, he develops. Think of the feeding of the 5,000. You got that whole, this summer, you heard how many sermons on I am the bread of life? Believe me, if you're a preacher, you can't think of anything new to say. When you got 4 weeks in a row that worked with that theme, riches were bad enough today, too. It wasn't last night. I'm done.